So welcome everybody. Today we have Katie McClure, who is a PhD candidate at the Kelvin Centre for Conservation and Cultural Heritage Research at the University of Glasgow. She'll be talking to us about Morton Sundour Fabrics. But firstly, I would like to invite Katie to just say a bit about herself while letting anybody else who comes along. Katie, over to you.
So thank you very much, Peter. Yeah, as Peter said, my name's Katie McClure and I'm a PhD student in History of Art here at the University of Glasgow. I had a slightly winding path to arrive here in History of Art. I started out with a BSc in chemistry, which I studied here again at the University of Glasgow. But when I started, I didn't have much of an idea of what I might want to do in the chemistry field. And I was really luckily and kind of coincidentally, for my bachelor's dissertation, I was introduced to a field called heritage science, where science is used to try and help us understand the objects and materials of the past. And that encouraged me to apply for a master's in archaeological materials science, which was a 2-year Erasmus international programme that was between Portugal, Greece, and Italy. So I was financially supported to pursue this by a number of funding bodies, and I was really lucky that one of the trustees of the Cross Trust, one of these funding bodies, Claire Meredith, put me in touch with Professor Anita Kwai here at the University of Glasgow. Some of you might know her from her presentation on the Crutchley archives last year, and she's now my main PhD supervisor. So it was a windy road to get here, but one full of a lot of luck. And as Peter said as well, I'm now based in the Kelvin Centre for Conservation and Cultural Heritage Research. It's in Kelvin Hall, which is a really interesting building here in Glasgow. When I was growing up, it was the Transport Museum in Glasgow, which now has a new building. And before that, it was an exhibition and events centre. So lots of people from Glasgow and the surrounding areas have some kind of good memories of this building. So it's quite an important building and apt for a centre for cultural heritage to be based there. There's lots of different types of heritage objects, but it's mostly object-based studies that we do at the Kelvin Centre. And it's a real interdisciplinary hub of experts from different areas. So we have people studying paintings and other types of artwork and technical art history. We have textile conservation specialists. And we have our group who looks at more modern materials, textile dyes, and a lot of different objects, trying to use science to try and understand them a little bit better. So my PhD now is, I'll not give you too many spoilers for the presentation, it's about a specific group of dyes. And as well as what I'm going to talk about today, which is the history of the dyes, it's also about trying to understand these dyes in the context of heritage collections. So looking at heritage collections and trying to use scientific methods to find these dyes in the collections and understand what needs that they have in terms of looking after them and making sure that we can preserve them for future generations. So that's kind of a bit about me. I live in Glasgow now, and back in Glasgow, and I'm presenting to you from home in Glasgow today. And that's kind of a bit about who I am.
Thank you very much, Katie. And I'm glad to say we now have 41 participants, which is a pretty good number. So some things have now settled down. And welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for coming along. Katie, will you start to talk about Morton Sundour, the Splendour of Unfadeable Dyes? Over to you.
Thank you. And I would love to talk about my favourite subject. Let me just give me 2 seconds to get things in the right place on my screen here. Sorry.
Are you okay?
Yep. So my talk today is going to follow the history of a remarkable and forward-thinking textile dynasty, which spanned a century and 3 generations. I'm going to talk a little bit about the entrepreneurial weaver chemist at the centre of it, James Morton, and the unusual and important group of synthetic dyes that have been little discussed in heritage context sorry, I've got a little message coming up here about control of my screen. I think it should be okay now. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be talking about an important and unusual group of synthetic dyes that have been little discussed in heritage contexts until this point. Before I get on to the kind of most exciting part for me, which is James Morton and the dyes, I have to start the story a little bit earlier, so around 50 years before, with his father, Alexander Morton, who began the Morton textile dynasty. So I'll start in the 1800s, the mid-1800s, in Ayrshire in southwest Scotland, which is coincidentally where I'm from, so it has some emotional significance to me too. So in Ayrshire at this time, it was a hub of textile manufacture, and different towns specialised in different artisanships. So for example, the town of Ayr specialised in embroidery, and Darvel, where Alexander Morton was from, specialised in making lace on hand looms. So the lace making industry at this time was a cottage industry, which was kind of based on looms in the family home. Agents would then come from the big cities, and they would come to Darvel and purchase the textiles and then sell them to clients in the cities. So this was the setting in which Alexander Morton grew up, but in the 1860s he became tired and dissatisfied by the poor deal that he and the other weavers were getting due to the large cuts that these agents were taking. So he decided to try and cut out the middleman and start acting as his own agent, selling directly to clients in the cities. And there's a retrospective book about the Morton textile dynasty written by Alexander Morton's grandson, Jocelyn Morton. And he writes that Alexander Morton started by going to cities like Glasgow and Carlisle that he thought were more accessible. And then he eventually plucked up the courage to go and sell in London too. And his idea worked remarkably well, and the benefits were clear to other weavers in the village too. So he gradually built up to a point where he was representing almost all of the weavers in Darvel. This travel to other cities, however, meant that he did become more aware of what was happening in the wider textile industry. And he began to see that the introduction of steam-powered lace-making machines was coming in the big cities. Alexander Morton was a businessman, and he recognised that the introduction of these machines would mean something important for the mass market. And he knew that the handloom weaving that was being carried out in Darvel wouldn't be able to compete just on its own. So in 1874, somewhat controversially, he introduced the first of these steam-powered lace-making machines to Darvel. They were big, huge pieces of equipment, like the one that you can see in the image on this slide here. And the products weren't exactly the same as what you could get on handloom project. So handloom weaving. So they did still use the handlooms for some specialist projects. However, the introduction of these lace-making machines was an amazing success. And by the following year, he had decided that he needed to launch this as a company, which he called Alexander Morton and Company. The launch of these machines meant that over the next 20 years, Alexander Morton ended up employing around 1,000 people from the area surrounding Darvel. And you can see in the map, if I compare it to what we had in the last slide, you can see that there was a cottage industry here, and suddenly there's 3 large lace mills that pop up. And it was really important for the town and the surrounding area. And that was all down to Alexander Morton's innovation and business acumen. So between when the company was founded in 1875 and 1900, lace making became increasingly successful for the area, but the company also began to branch out into making other types of fabric. For example, they would make upholstery and tapestry of silk and wool. This diversification of the business was somewhat driven by Alexander's son, James Morton, who I mentioned at the start of this presentation, and his introduction and increasing power within the company. James Morton was passionate about and heavily influenced by the arts and crafts movement. So, for example, William Morris. And it's visible in the fabrics that he was producing at this time that these were where his influences came from. This side of the company continued to grow during this period. And by 1900, it was such a major part of the business that they decided to give it its own site. They kept the lace-making side of the business in Darvel, and they opened a site in Carlisle to make these other types of fabrics. 1900 coincided with the time that James Morton took over the company from his father, where his father retired. Retired might have been a strong word, because actually what happened was that he moved to Ireland and opened a carpet making company. So you can start to see here what a multi-locational, sprawling business these Morton companies would become. By this time, they were making carpets, they were making upholstery fabrics and tapestries, and they were making lace across Scotland, the north of England, and in Ireland. We've already spoken a little bit by now about James Morton, and I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about him and give him a formal introduction. He was born in 1867, so he was 33 at the time of taking over Alexander Morton and Company. As I mentioned, he was really inspired by the arts and crafts movement and an avid follower of William Morris. However, he differed from many of the people in the arts and crafts movement in that he didn't believe in that the traditional ways of production and the traditional materials used for production were inherently better than the industrial methods. James Morton was an industrialist at heart, and he believed that it was possible to use industrial methods to create arts and crafts textiles which embodied the quality of the movement. However, he wasn't oblivious to some of the problems with these materials that were emerging around this time, and he was rudely awoken to the poor state of affairs surrounding the longevity of early synthetic dyes around 1902. He writes in a lecture that he gave to the Royal Society of the Arts in 1929 that he was viewing his company's tapestries in the shop window of the luxury department store Liberty in London when he noticed that they were so faded and so radically different than when they were made that he scarcely recognised his own work. When he inquired about what had happened to the display when he went into the store, Liberty told him that the fabrics had only been on display in the window for around a week. He decided that this state of affairs was unacceptable, and he resolved that he had to find a way to produce textiles which retained their colour on exposure to ordinary sunlight. James Morton then set about collecting as many of the commercially available dye samples from the UK market that he could, and he mounted them on die fastness cards like the one that you can see here on this slide. The Science Museum have an amazing collection of these cards, and they're essentially pieces of card with fabric fixed to them, and half of the fabric is exposed to the light and half of the fabric is covered so that you can compare the original colour of the fabric with the colour change after exposure. Morton tells this story, interestingly, in this 1929 lecture, saying that he brought these samples back up from London to his home in Penrith, and he displaced his newly planted tomato plants that his gardener had just put in and repurposed the greenhouse in order to make it a humid, sunlight-exposed fastness testing facility. This experiment was useful in that he found the results of it very shocking. And while it was kind of common knowledge at this time that the new synthetic dyes developed since William Henry Perkins' first synthetic dye, Movine, in the 1860s, people knew generally that they had quite poor longevity. The speed with which the colours had faded was more rapid than he could have even imagined. He writes that even deep shades on expensive velvets became almost white within a week. This fading was more pronounced on cotton than on wool and silk, which is not that surprising because cotton takes dye less readily than these animal fibres, but the results were generally very poor across the board. This included some of the natural colours which had come before, which kind of broke down some preconceptions about the natural dyes all behaving perfectly and the synthetic dyes behaving very poorly. And there were only a couple or one really major exception to this. The most important exception, according to Morton, was the alizarin, which is this molecule here. Alizarin was a major component of the natural dye madder, which has been important for many centuries. And it was synthetically recreated in 1868. Morton found that he could use alizarin and the alizarin dyes to create reds and deep wine colours, which could withstand exposure to sunlight. However, you can't launch a whole range of fabrics with only one dye, and he found that it wasn't possible to get the other colours that would be needed to make a dye, like a full dye range. So there was a particular gap in the colour wheel around blues, yellows and greens where there were no dyes on the commercial market that had sufficient resistance to fading. Those of you who might know a little bit about dyes might find this somewhat surprising, as I did, because indigo has a reputation for excellent colour fastness when you read about it in general popular culture. However, when Morton performed his fastness tests, while indigo performed really well on wool, cotton fibre still faded relatively quickly. So he was left with this gap after testing all the fibres in the market, and he was looking for blues, yellows, and the resultant greens specifically. Coincidentally, and very luckily for James Morton, a major discovery had been made in the previous year in Germany. A Swiss chemist named René Bohn had been attempting to make an anthraquinone analogue of indigo for the German chemical company BASF. What he made didn't actually achieve what he was setting out to, so it was a different molecule than he had hoped. But he did coincidentally synthesize a molecule which shared properties with both the anthraquinone dyes, like alizarin, and indigo. The first compound that he created was a blue dye that he named indanthrone, and this name was derived from indigo and anthrone, which is a molecule with 3 benzene rings and a carbonyl group. The same year, using a really similar process, he produced a yellow dye called flavanthrone, and these dyes became the basis of a new class of dyes called the anthraquinoid vat dyes. The first part of this name comes from the fact that they contained the anthraquinone, or part of the anthraquinone molecule, which you can see in the slide here. And the second part of the name, vat, comes from their method of being applied to the fibre. So the vatting method uses insoluble molecules like the ones that we have here and chemically reduces them into soluble forms, which can then be applied to the fibre. This was a development on the methodology which had been used to dye with indigo for many years before. With these new dyes, BASF launched a new range of dyes that they called indanthrone, and they started to develop similar colours and new colours with similar templates. There's a few things to note about these molecules which differentiate them from the other dyes that were available on the market at the time. I'm showing some of the anthraquinoid vat dyes in this slide and some of the other dyes that were available at the time, just to illustrate these differences. So they were generally much larger molecules with big planar structures which didn't easily flex or twist. They were generally very stable because their structures contained a lot of fused aromatic rings and had a lot of delocalized electrons. And they were really insoluble in water because of the non-polar natures of the molecules. These chemical properties were the key to the value of these compounds for Morton's purposes. The stability meant that the bonds within the molecules didn't break down when they were irradiated by sunlight, and their insolubility meant that they didn't move or dissolve when the items were washed. This gave these molecules light and wash fastnesses, so resistance to the sun and washing, that had never been observed before. There was also a couple of drawbacks to the chemistry of the dyes, though. Conversion to this soluble reduced form that they needed to be converted to in order to be applied to the fibres required really strong alkaline conditions, so we're talking pH 12 to pH 14. Cellulosic fibres could withstand these high pHs, but it rapidly caused the breakdown of the proteins in woolen silk fibres. So previously, Alexander Morton and Company upholstery products had mostly used woolen silk on almost all of their production. They also sometimes included cotton, but this was usually in conjunction with woolen silk. So the use of these dyes meant that it was no longer possible for them to use the types of fabrics that they had been used to using. So this meant that they had to decide whether it was worth the compromise of changing the fabrics that they used completely. In addition, the complicated nature of these molecules meant that they were expensive to synthesize and therefore expensive to buy. And their unusual dyeing process meant that they were also expensive to dye with, and not many places could dye with them because it required specific types of equipment. Morton speaks in his 1929 lecture that I previously mentioned about the price of anthraquinoid vat-dyed fabrics being around 50% more than common alternatives. Ultimately, though, they decided to take the risk and they entered into an exclusive agreement with Liberty's Fabrics division in order to launch a range of textiles which they sold with a guarantee that they wouldn't fade before the fabric itself started to break down. This deal began in 1904, and the textiles sold were directed towards the type of customers that you might still associate with Liberty Fabrics today. They were high-end designs which came at an expensive price point, and they were intended for customers who were unlikely to worry about the cost. As well as the deal with Liberties, Alexander Morton and Company also came to an agreement with the United Turkey Red Company, a company of dyers based in Alexandria in Scotland. And they decided that the United Turkey Red Company would dye the fabrics for them and sell these fabrics exclusively to Alexander Morton and Company. The dyes at this time still came from BASF, and Morton was responsible for weaving the designs that they would then sell in Liberties. While this exclusive deal with Liberties gave the company a good start, they quickly realised that exclusivity of Liberty's clientele meant that they weren't able to access the mass market. They decided that they had to try and figure out a way to market these very expensive products to the mass market for whom the price mattered more acutely. So in around 1906, the company launched their own range, which they called Sundour Fabrics. The fabrics came with the same guarantee of fade resistance that the Liberty range did, and they were still dyed in Alexandria, and the dyes were still bought from Germany. This name choice, Sundour, was very deliberate, and the aim of it was to illustrate the value of these dyes from a consumer's first encounter with the products. The first part of the name is quite obvious, it represents the sun, and the second part is from a Scots word, which today I still use and recognise as meaning gloomy or moody, but Morton intended it for its other meaning to mean stubborn. So the name of that the company come up with for the dyes was therefore based around the property of the dyes. They were stubborn to the sun. So as a side note here on pronunciation, it's very possible that anyone who's previously been familiar with the company might have heard the company referred to as Sundour. I think this is potentially an accent thing, and I find it difficult to say Sundour as someone who's still used to using the word dour. But I'm not saying that my pronunciation is definitely the correct one. Alongside the apt name, the company got straight to advertising the fade resistance of their products. This great example on the front page of this sample book held by the Science Museum is a typical example of their early advertising. It shows typical dyes before and after their exposure to 7 months of sunlight. And then it shows Sundour fabrics, which were dyed with the anthraquinoid vat dyes. James Morton's advertising and selling skills and his ways of illustrating the importance of these dyes are really key to the success of the Sundour range, and these advertisements are a particularly good illustration of that. So the range was first launched in 1906. We start to see the fabrics mentioned in advertisements in newspapers around the spring of 1907. At this time, it's usually just brief mentions within larger advertisements for textile sellers. And you can see on the right-hand side of the slide here, a textile design called Pleasance by the decorated designer René Bohn for the company around this time. The use of designs by really well-known household designer names such as Mawson or, for example, Voisey was typical for the company at the time, and it feeds into James Morton's passion for the arts and crafts textiles, but it also helped to popularise the range by using well-known household design names. The edges of the fabrics are generally annotated where we still have them with the name of the fabric, and then usually also Splendour of Unfadeable. In collections now, when we still have any preserved labels, they always use the line guaranteed unfadable. So fabric started appearing in the spring of 1907, and actually by the summer of 1907 and into the mid-1910s, the name recognition of the brand continues to grow, and advertisement for textile sellers often centralised and promoted the ranges of Sundour fabrics that they stocked because they were so popular. They were often referred to as the famous Sundour fabrics. And this figure on the top of the slide here is an article from Vogue which recommended these exciting new products. So it wasn't an advertisement, but it was talking about how these fabrics had come into fashion. The success of the products wasn't just confined to the UK, and their advertising was equally prominent in newspapers in the US and Canada. So by around the 1910s, the company was very successful and had grown significantly. And Morton decided at this point that it was no longer practicable to get their yarns dyed elsewhere, and they intended to take this in-house. Part of the reasoning for this was that they wanted to develop the skills to dye piece goods or pre-woven blocks of fabric rather than just individual yarns. This had never been done before with the anthraquinoid vat dyes, but the company had now invested so heavily in the dyes that they were able to take on this research question and prepared to take the risks that were associated with it. By 1914, the Sundour range had become such a successful part of the parent company, Alexander Morton and Company, that everything was now restructured, and the growing network of companies now existed under the Morton Sundour Fabrics umbrella company. So I've chosen just one more advertisement here, mostly because of its date. This was an advertisement which again centralised the Sundour Fabrics and was advertising Lee Longland, a textile seller in Birmingham. And you'll see that the date of this advertisement is the 25th of July, 1914. This was a period just before great change would befall Morton Sundour Fabrics. As we all know, despite the as we all know, sorry, by the following month, the UK was at war. And by this time, despite the success of the Sundour fabric range, no dye manufacturers in the UK had even attempted to manufacture the anthraquinoid vat dyes. This meant that Morton Sundour Fabrics was completely reliant on the import of dyes from Germany, which had completely stopped at the outbreak of the war. Morton writes about his dilemma in his 1929 lecture, and he went to approach several dye manufacturers to see if anyone might consider trying to manufacture these products. However, none were interested, in particular because they were already really busy during wartime, and they were financially comfortable because they were producing dyes for wartime purposes and didn't have the capacity to take on further research projects, particularly a big one like producing a new type of dye. Morton resolved that he would be required to try and synthesize the dyes himself, otherwise the company would go under. So he and his head dyer, a man called Rudolf Hübner, who Morton describes as having a flair for things chemical, while not being a very profound or exact chemist, managed to trace out the synthesis of the blue and yellow dyes discovered by Bohn in 1901. There was some evidence that they might have had help from other chemists or access to relevant documents, but it was nonetheless a great achievement and the first time that this had been done in the UK. So by just a few months later, in November 1914, they'd managed to produce the first few grams of both dyes. However, a bigger problem lay ahead of them in trying to get adequate equipment and machinery to turn this into bulk production. They managed to overcome this quite quickly, however, and they started production of indanthrene blue and flavanthrone yellow in March of 1915. They came up with their own name for this dye range that they called Caledon, as a callback to James Morton's heritage from Scotland. And by 1917, they were also creating further products from the class that had previously been made in Germany. By 1918, they felt that the dye production had outgrown the site that they had at Carlisle, and they decided to open a site specifically for dye production in Grangemouth on the east coast of Scotland. They were encouraged to do this by rumblings about the introduction of the so-called Dyestuffs Act, which actually didn't come into force until 1920, but was being discussed before. And the reason for this Dyestuffs Act was that they were trying to incentivise dye production in the UK to try and prevent the industry becoming so reliant on German dyes again. It's worth just stopping here to take stock and consider how many roles the Mortons were now playing in the textile industry at the time. They were producing textiles of many different types across different sites. They were producing lace, they were producing upholstery fabrics, they were producing tapestries and carpets. They were dyeing yarns and piece goods at their site in Carlisle, and they were synthesising the dyes now that they needed to use at Grangemouth. It's quite unusual for a textile company to be playing so many different roles in the industry, and it came about through necessity. So it's no surprise that James Morton felt so passionate and invested in every part and product needed for this whole process. Needless to say, the company was really successful at this time, and when they were set up in Grangemouth, they started to not only synthesise the dyes that had been previously made in Germany, but also they began to develop dyes of their own. Without a doubt, the most important development to the anthraquinoid vat dye class that happened in Grangemouth was the discovery of Caledon jade green, which was a discovery that was of such major importance that I've decided to use it as the background for all of my slides here. Dyeing with green had been really problematic for almost all of history, which is somewhat surprising considering how abundant the colour is in the natural world. However, greens with good longevity were really difficult to come by until the discovery of Caledon jade green, and they were generally made of mixtures in blue and yellow dyes, which wasn't always effective. So the importance of this discovery was neatly summarised by Dr. Croydon Meredith Whitaker in 1951 when he said that the dyer had to wait until 1920 for Caledon jade green, which first enabled him to give with confidence a jade green hue suitable for soft furnishings and washing fabrics. Meantime, dyers were compelled to write thousands of letters regretting inability to dye the hues requested. So I hope that gives you an idea of how much this was wanted by the industry, this new colour. And James Morton was aware of that, and he had really intentionally set out to hopefully get the company to produce this green dye. And while he initially regretted that it was a slightly bluer green colour than he had hoped, it soon became the jewel of the Caledon and anthraquinoid vat dye collections. You can see on this slide that it was an important product by the fact that the dye itself was specifically advertised in newspapers. This image here in the middle of the slide, which is slightly ironically reprinted in black and white from an amazing painting that was commissioned by ICI, which really showed the colour of the dye, illustrates the importance that the product had to the company in the long run. On the left-hand side of the slide, I've included a few relevant objects to Caledon Jade Green that I've come across during my research for my PhD project. So the example at the bottom is a pattern book from a pattern book by DuPont that was published in the 1940s. They had also begun to produce this dye, but they called it by their own name, Ponsol Jade Green. Above that is the cover of a commemorative book by Morton Sundour Fabrics, celebrating 50 years since the founding of the company in 1956. The book is covered with Caledon Jade Green dyed book cloth, which came from another one of the many subsidiary companies of Morton Sundour Fabrics called Sundour Book Cloths. And the top image is of a jar of Caledon Jade Green, which came into my possession really recently and through great coincidence. So one of the labs I work in sometimes here at the university was doing a clear out, and they had some items sitting ready for disposal. And I noticed this jar with the ICI logo sitting with its label facing away from me. And when I turned it round, it turned out to be a bottle of the dye that I'd been studying throughout my whole PhD from 1941. And it was the only dye amongst all the chemicals that were going out for disposal. So I've decided to take this as some sort of sign that this was the right time to be doing this research at the University of Glasgow. This dye is still considered today by most experts to be the most outstanding member of the anthraquinoid vat dye class. It's got a bright, recognisable hue that's noticeable in fabrics, particularly from the 1920s and 30s. And it's got one of the best resistances to light and washing in the whole collection of dyes. So while the dye manufacture division of the company, Scottish Dyes Limited, was developing these important compounds and becoming an important name in the market, times were generally changing for dye production in the UK. The British Dyestuffs Corporation had gradually begun to absorb smaller dye companies around this time. And while James Morton was initially very hesitant to that, by the mid-1920s he had sold a controlling interest in the company to them. The British Dyestuffs Corporation were then absorbed into the newly formed Imperial Chemical Industries later in the same year. It might come as a surprise because he was clearly so invested in the importance of these dyes. However, there was a couple of contributing factors to this. The first was the general conglomerating of chemical companies that was happening within the UK at the time around the formation of ICI. James Morton was likely to have seen this coming. And the second important thing to bear in mind was that James Morton's extensive portfolio of companies that he managed under the Morton Sundour umbrella had been steadily growing throughout this period. And his key passion was still the production of textiles. That's why he moved into the production of dyes, in order to give him the ability to make the textiles that he wanted to make. One really important addition to the Morton Sundour Fabrics company portfolio was the incorporation of standfast dyers and printers in Lancaster. This new company would play two important roles for Morton Sundour Fabrics. First, it would allow them to expand the textile printing side of their business, which wasn't possible in Carlisle because the river was so polluted by that time that it couldn't support a further dye works. Secondly, it would allow them to colour fabrics with the anthraquinoid vat dyes and sell them to other textile production companies, which helped to further embed these unfadeable dyes within the industry. I hope this goes to show that despite the fact that Morton let go of Scottish Dyes Limited, his enthusiasm for the anthraquinoid vat dyes never faded. In fact, as conditions of his agreement to sell the company, he requested that he remain as chairman of the Grangemouth dye production site and that the site continue to be used for the production of anthraquinoid vat dyes. His investment in this site and his advocacy for the site continued until his death. And Grangemouth continued to be a key site for anthraquinoid vat dye production until close to the end of the 20th century. His movement away from running the dye manufacturing side of the business also gave him better capacity to focus on the production of textiles, which was his first passion. By this time, Morton Sundour Fabrics had really mastered the art of marketing their still expensive products to the mass market. I've got a couple of examples here of 1920s and 1930s advertising materials, which really forefront the practical aspects of the important practical aspects of the dyes. The one on the right was part of an extensive newspaper marketing campaign from 1924, where curtains and upholstery were depicted in front of windows to illustrate the impact of sunlight exposure. These advertisements were all illustrated by woodcut prints by the designer Charles Payne, which are quite charming, and they almost all include a window to really emphasise the vulnerability of the textiles to fading. The wording of some of these articles varies from charming to slightly sickly. I've chosen one of the less sickly ones here, and I'm just going to read it out to give you a flavour for what the language was like in these articles at that time. So the advertisement I've chosen is called Grandmother's Parlour, and it says, "Your grandmother feared the sun for her curtains and her coverings as much as she feared the rain for her best bonnet. The sun used to do as much harm in the drawing room as mice in the larder or frost in the water pipes. There's no more need to fear the sun. Let it in, make it welcome, filter it through Sundour curtains. No Sundour fabric fades. This is guaranteed." So that gives you an idea for how they were emphasising the chemical properties of these dyes in their advertising. On the other side of the page, you can see that the company were really selective in the way that they advertised the properties of the dyes to specific purposes. So in this catalogue of rugs for children's nurseries, you can see that the first page emphasises the fact that these rugs are washable, and this is typical of their advertising for children's products, which are likely to need washed. So I think that these advertisements really bring to light the key link between the chemical properties of the dyes and the practical application, and how the chemical properties were really the reason that James Morton was able to justify the price of the dyes. However, one of the advertisements, that particularly the Sundour Nursery Rugs one, also brings to attention an ongoing issue with the fabrics. So you can see that these rugs are unusually made of cotton. And this illustrates the fact that by the 1930s, the dyes were still not commonly or easily used on non-cellulosic fibres. It doesn't mean that they were never used. There had been some adaptations to processes to allow them to be used on wool and silk, but it was never really widely taken up. However, major developments to fibre types around this time did soften the compromises that the company had had to make several years before. So throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, the semi-synthetic fibre rayon was launched and developed on the market. Rayon's made from cellulose, the same as cotton, but it was often marketed as artificial silk because it had a shiny, lustrous look to it. After great strides and developments, rayons that were made from different processes, but eventually mostly the viscose process, became really prominent for Morton Sundour Fabrics around 1910s and 1920s, and became important parts of this Morton Sundour collection, filling in the spaces that had been left by the poor applicability to dyes, of the dyes to proteinaceous fibres like wool and silk. So as a result of this, we now have anthraquinoid bat-dyed objects in our collections that have a range of different surface effects. Most of them are cellulosic, kind of traditional cotton-looking fabrics, and some of them have shiny, lustrous, silk-looking effects that have come through their application to viscose rayon. Interestingly, this article from the 1930s explicitly mentions Caledon Jade Green Textiles as a star of the artificial silk exhibition of rayon fabrics in the Albert Hall in 1931. So Morton Sundour Fabrics continued to be successful at marketing desirable, practical fabrics until around the 1960s. And as a result of the longevity of the company, we can see many different periods and styles represented in the textiles that they made, and I've got a few of them in this slide here. Continuously, all of their advertising and all of their labelling was centred around the fact that these fabrics still came with a guaranteed unfadability, and the fact that they were able to continue this showed that the fabrics actually really did hold up to that. So there's one last element to the story, and that's the founding of yet another company by James Morton in 1928. while James Morton was really happy with what he'd achieved at Morton Sundour Fabrics, and he was creating these really practical textiles for the mass consumer, he was drawn to create maybe less practical, more experimental artistic textiles for customers that were seeking textiles maybe as art pieces. And for this purpose, he founded a new company, Edinburgh Weavers, in 1928. Very quickly, this name became a bit of a misnomer because even though the site was founded just outside Edinburgh, it was within a couple of years moved down to Carlisle with their other sites. And while James Morton founded this business, it wasn't his influence that was particularly important here. In 1932, his son, Alistair Morton, took control of the company. And Alistair Morton was an artist who was firmly interested and embedded in the modernist art movement. Just as James Morton had redirected his father's company towards the textiles of the arts and crafts movement, Alistair Morton moved Edinburgh Weavers into a new type of design, which he called constructivist fabrics, which have a kind of modern art look to them. The fabrics were forward-thinking, radical designs and took the textiles of the company into a brand new era. These new designs looked different from the Morton Sundour Fabrics which came before, but examples which still contain their tags are still listed as guaranteed unfadable, showing that Alistair Morton continued his father's legacy, bringing the importance of the unfadable anthraquinoid vat dyes to a new customer base in a new age. By Alistair Morton's death in 1963, the Morton family had been making important changes and influencing the UK textile dyeing industry for around a century. The second half of this was primarily driven by the availability of the anthraquinoid vat dyes. And I hope it's clear that it was the chemistry of these dyes that allowed the company to continue to be successful throughout the 20th century. So I thought I would just wrap up this presentation by recapping what we discussed and kind of just taking stock of how big an industry this was. So the business started in the 1860s with lace making, which was first done in the home, and Alexander Morton opened a new company, Alexander Morton and Company, introducing mechanised lace making to the Irvine Valley and to Darvel. By 1900, they had a new site in Carlisle and they were employing around 1,000 people, and James Morton took over the company. Around 1901 and 1902, James Morton had noticed this gap in the market around unfadable dyes and been able to identify that the anthraquinoid vat dyes developed in Germany in 1901 would fill that gap. And in 1906, they launched this range of Sundour Unfadeable fabrics. Over the next decade, they started to dye the fabrics themselves and they synthesised the dyes in the UK for the very first time, restructured the company to Morton Sundour Fabrics, a company which continued to be successful until the 1960s. In 1920, they synthesised Caledon Jade Green, arguably the most important anthraquinoid vat dye ever. And then by 1924, they were selling fabrics dyed with these dyes to other companies and embedding them within the industry. And then in 1928 and into the 1930s, the textiles of Edinburgh Weavers started to influence a new generation. So that was my talk for today, and I just wanted to say thank you all to everyone for listening, and I wanted to just say thanks to my funders, the Scottish Graduate School for the Arts and Humanities, my project hosts, the University of Glasgow and the Kelvin Centre, and my supervisors, Professor Anita Kwai and Dr. David France, for their kind supervision. So thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you very much, Katie, for a wonderful and, may I say so, colourful talk. We have a few questions here which I'll put to you. My first and most general one, which will come up in chat, is was Morton Sundour and Scottish dyes the major force in developing unfadable dyes in the UK? Would you say that's a fair statement?
Yeah, I think that it's really nobody else was touching them at the time. I think because they were so different and complicated to dye with, and there was a lot of compromises that had to be made. So yeah, Morton Sundour and Scottish dyes were key in developing these dyes, and nobody else was particularly interested in them to start with, which is somewhat illustrated in the fact that James Morton couldn't get anyone else to produce them. He didn't want to start producing the dyes on his own. He didn't want to have to learn all of that and develop these complicated pieces of equipment. But because there was nobody else who was willing to take that on. He was the driver of that, and his companies were the driver of that in the UK.
Okay. Right, I've got getting a few more questions in at the moment, but let me turn to Henry Reps's question, because Henry is at Imperial College, and Imperial College has a lot to do with the development of the so-called palatine dye, particularly monostraw fast blue, because Patrick Lindstedt at Imperial worked out the structure of it. Unfortunately, by working out the structure of it, he enabled Ego Farben to copy it, but we won't go into that now. In fact, Henry just asked another question about chemical structure, but I'll come to that in a moment. Talking about the monostraw dyes in particular, I think they were first discovered by accident, weren't they, in Scottish dyes just before it was taken over by the British Dye Stuff Corporation. It was one of the very last things that Scottish dyes did, although of course the actual development of it was in ICI. Is that correct?
Yeah, so when I've read several books that talk about the history of Grangemouth, and the two major developments that happened at Scottish Dyes Limited were first the development of Caledon Jade Green, and then the development of the first of the Monstral series, so the phthalocyanines. And there's a rabbit hole there that is to be gone down at some point in the future, but yes, certainly, like they were very proud of the fact that that was where it was first accidentally discovered, and those were the two major developments that happened at Scottish Dyes Limited that have had.
Okay, so did Morton Sundour use the monostraw dyes themselves?
I've not found any evidence of that. I think that they were really, really focused on the vat dyes. All their textiles that I've seen that specify what they're dyed with, which is surprisingly quite a lot. Normally that doesn't exist, but I guess because they had these different roles within the industry, they were advertising the dyes through their textiles too. They say all vat dyes or dyed with vat dyes, Sundour vat dyes. It's all these anthraquinoid vat dyes that they used primarily. I've not come across any examples of them really using or advertising that they were using other things.
And also, Henry made the point, but of course, it's a very famous film about the discovery of monostraw fast blue. I was just wondering, I'm not sure if this is really a fair question to you because you're not looking at the history of ICI, whether you have any other films that have been made about either the monostraw dyes or indeed any of the Caledon dyes. Do you know aware of any other films or documentaries about these dyes?
Nothing that I've come across, but if there is any, I will be interested and I'll get back to you about that because I haven't particularly been looking at film and that element, but you know, we have great archives from the stuff that was going on at Grangemouth, so there might be stuff there, particularly maybe at the National Library of Scotland that I can go and have a look into. So thank you for the prompt. I will go and look for them now.
Just also mentioned another question. Were the vat dyes, I mean, obviously, vat dyes are obviously intended for fabric, but were they using anything else like colour photography, or did they have any other uses? Postage stamps, maybe? Were they used for anything else?
So they were the primary purpose of them was for dyeing cellulosic fibres, so mostly cotton, also rayon, but they were also used. Some of them have been used as pigments. So indanthrene is, when I speak about that to the technical art historians in the Kelvin Centre, they often recognise it as a paint pigment that was used. The problem with indanthrene as a paint pigment was that you needed an awful lot of it to get any colour to go anywhere, and it was really expensive. So its primary use was still for textile dyes. And then I've just been looking into recently, and I've not got a full grasp of this, but because the molecules were so stable, they could withstand the temperatures that were needed for vulcanizing and for casting of plastics. So they were also used for the colouring of plastics as well. And that was a major problem, finding dyes that were stable enough to colour plastics. I'm not aware of anything for photographic materials or anything in that respect, but they were using them for other products in the market, particularly when they were involved with ICI, and ICI were making these other products, so they had access to the different parts of the business so that they could, we have some dyes that might be relevant for that purpose in there, and it kind of nurtured that reaching in and kind of innovation in that way to use the dyes for different purposes.
Henry, one final question from Henry. He's asking, where was the chemical structure of the Caledon dye known from the outset, and were they correct?
That's a good question that I haven't I haven't massively looked into. And do you know, it was funny. I was thinking about that when I was making this presentation for here today. I was wondering when I was including these structures and thinking about, in particular, when René Bohn set out to make that anthraquinone analog of indigo, what how much did he know in terms of what I think at the start that he thought that he had been successful in making the molecule that he thought he'd made. But I'm not exactly sure how that fits in terms of chemical structure. So that's something that's come up to me in the process of making this presentation that I'm not 100% sure about, and I'll go and have a look at that.
Yeah. Two questions about people who worked at Morton Sundour. Somebody is asking, do you know the name of the original helper of Morton to make the first home-known dyes? I think you mentioned his name briefly, but I must admit I didn't catch it myself. You know, the chemist who was not an educated chemist. Yeah. But what was his name again? I think you did say it, but very quickly.
So the person that he cites as being the main kind of co-conspirator in making the dyes was Rudolf Hübner. That's the main other name that I've found, and they worked as the two. But there was certainly in the development of many of their names have escaped me. There's a long list of names when you see the start of the development of Caledon Jade Green and the other dyes that were produced at Grangemouth. There was a number of other people. The business had grown significantly by that time, and it was a real team of chemists as well as non-chemists that were producing the dyes. But Rudolf Hübner was the first that he was working with, who was his head dyer.
At that part of your talk, you also hinted that they might have used academic chemists to help them. Are you aware of the identity of any of these academic chemists? I mean, Arthur Green springs to mind, for example.
So they speak about, I think Rudolf Hübner's brother was a chemist. And I think I've not heard any of this from James Morton or the primary documents, but there's a great book by M.R. Fox that I've got listed here from 1987, where he speculates that either Rudolf Hübner's brother might have had some input into the reconstruction of these dyes, or alternatively, that they might have had access to some of the papers from Germany. I'm not sure if it was the Bohn papers or if it was other synthesis papers, but it's a vague mention, which I imagine has come from dedicated archival research, but that's the only mention that I've seen of it.
Okay, I've got a question here from Joey Lynn Roberts saying, to what extent did Morton Sundour employ chemists before World War One, and if so, where were they recruited from?
So pre-World War One, I've got my impression is that they didn't employ any chemists. They had people who were really, the dyers had to be practically trained in chemistry to be dyeing with the anthraquinoid bat dyes. It was a chemical reduction process, and there was chemistry involved in that. But my understanding is that pre-World War One, there was no formal chemists employed by the company. But I could be wrong, and there might be more in that. But I would think that if there was chemists employed by the company at that time, that they might have been slightly more useful in terms of when they were trying to reconstruct this chemical process. And I haven't seen any mention of that.
Okay. I've got a couple, thank you very much, Katie. I've got a couple of questions of my own. I was careful to let everybody else's questions come first. And the one is that in this advert from Canada that you show about roughly halfway through your talk, Sundour is described as unfathomable with a B rather than a D. I'm wondering if that was a typo. Surely it must be a typo.
It might be a typo.
About halfway. It was the first major batch of adverts you showed, about halfway through. Maybe a little bit.
Oh yeah, I didn't notice that when I was rummaging through my many clippings.
You got it. Morton Sundour is unfathomable.
Yeah, you would think a large title like that might have had some proofreading before it was put in. It was a fairly big excerpt from a newspaper page as well, for that typo to be there. But yes, I think you're right.
It's a typo, okay, right? I just wondered if unfathomable was an old term for unfadable, but it seems very unlikely. Okay. Two more questions, one from me, one to come up from somebody else. My other question is there any connection between Scottish dyes at Grangemouth and the current Earnot plant? Or was the Earnot plant put there by BP quite independently of the Scottish dyes?
So I think that I'm not 100% sure about the plant that you mentioned, but I think that now the Scottish Dyes site that's in Grangemouth is now Fujifilm. So I think that there was lots of industry in Grangemouth at the time, particularly surrounding, you know, as you say, BP and other kind of companies. So I think that the ICI site was handed over to Fujifilm in the 1990s.
Okay, right, okay. So separate then. Okay, two more messages have come up. One of them may be just congratulating you. No. Now, this is a question from Nigel Robertson. Was the presence of a munition factory north of Carlisle a factor, like the Gretna Green plant, a factor in situating the factory in Carlisle because of a good supply of chemicals?
That's interesting, and I didn't actually know about that at all. So it would be interesting, certainly, to look into that. I haven't really questioned, and it's a good prompt for me to question why, in particular, they chose Carlisle to bring their fabric development there. I would think that when they initially moved the site, they were still not dyeing in house. It was just as a weavers, really. It wasn't as a dye works. So I would think that probably wouldn't have been the primary reason for them doing that. But
water supply mainly, probably a supply of water from a away, maybe, I don't know.
Yes, and that's my idea of why it was where it was in Carlisle. But yeah, I'm not sure, and I don't. My feeling is that that's probably not an influence, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Okay, well, Katie, that's the end of the question. So it only remains for me to thank you once again for another remarkable addition to our list of online talks, which will now go up as a recording if anybody wants to see it again. And thank you again for such a wonderful discussion of a very important aspect of British dye making. One more question, one more thing, but no, just great talk. Okay, well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Next month,
thank you, everyone.
A different talk from David Stuart Anderson, who is a professor of pharmacy, and he's going to talk about the very interesting topic of why do we have chemists on one hand and pharmacists on the other, and why are pharmacists called chemists, but chemists are never called pharmacists. So it's all about the great pharmacy-chemistry divide, and it all goes back to legislation in the 19th century, mid-19th century. So I'm sure that'll be a fascinating talk in itself, and I look forward to seeing you again next month, third Tuesday of the month at 2 p.m. And meanwhile, goodbye for now. Goodbye and thank you. So let me just